The story of the Ravencroft family begins not with triumph but with whispers that have carried through the centuries, whispers of wealth built not merely on the soil of America's expanding frontier, but on something darker that fed upon devotion, fear, and silence. In 1824, at the height of a decade marked by both religious revival and social upheaval, the family arrived in Virginia with fortunes already heavy and reputations already shaded. Where their gold had come from, no one could truly say, though speculation passed quietly among those who dared. Some believed their wealth stemmed from opium, others from war profiteering, and still others insisted that it came from stranger, more occult origins. Whatever the truth, what mattered was that the Ravencrofts had money, and with money came the power to carve a place for themselves in the heart of a land eager for salvation yet vulnerable to manipulation. They selected Ravenwood, a sprawling estate on the edge of dense forests and low, fog-strewn marshes, a place already carrying an air of isolation that seemed to suit them well. It was here that Ezra Ravencroft, patriarch and iron-willed visionary, announced the creation of the Church of the Pure Spirit. To outward eyes, it resembled yet another of the revivalist movements sweeping through the young nation, but beneath the sermons and hymns there beat a heart of secrecy. Ezra's teachings were unlike those found in the churches of town. His was a doctrine of ascension, of purification through fire, blood, and silence. He spoke of casting off the impurities of the body to reveal the radiant soul within, and though the language seemed, at first, merely metaphorical, those who remained grew to understand the brutal literalism hidden in his words. By 1826, the church had already drawn hundreds of adherents. Families desperate for meaning, young men eager for belonging, women burdened by grief or despair, all were welcomed into the Ravencroft fold. They came to Ravenwood for gatherings that stretched through nights, their chants carrying through the dark woods, their voices breaking against the heavy stone of the manor. The Ravencrofts themselves, 7 in number with Ezra at their head, became figures of awe and fear. Clad in robes of pure white stitched with crimson thread, they moved among the faithful with a silence that unsettled even as it inspired devotion. Their wealth allowed them to build not merely a chapel but an entire compound, dormitories for those who renounced the outside world, kitchens that prepared ritual meals, workshops where symbols were carved and altars erected. What grew most notorious, though, were the rituals of ascension. The church spoke of liberation, of freeing the spirit from its earthly prison. Once a year, chosen members would disappear into the lower halls of Ravenwood, carried in procession beneath the house's grand staircase into chambers most never saw. There, by torchlight and the smell of burning herbs, the faithful were tested. Some were starved, others cut, still others left in pits of silence for days until madness blurred the edge between prayer and delirium. The Ravencrofts watched, always from a distance, their eyes catching the firelight like predators behind glass. Few who descended were seen again. Their names were written into the Book of Ascended, recorded as martyrs, their fates never explained. Yet among the community outside Ravenwood, rumors circulated, rumors of screams in the night, of shallow graves in the forest, of livestock drained of blood and left in grotesque poses. In 1831, a violent storm tore through Virginia, flooding roads and uprooting trees, but within Ravenwood the congregation celebrated. It was during this storm that the first Great Ascension was said to have taken place. Over 30 members vanished into the earth that night, their families told that their loved ones had risen beyond flesh. But those who lived near the estate spoke of strange fires in the woods, of black smoke that did not smell of wood or oil but of burning flesh and hair. They told of shapes carried across the fields at midnight, of chanting louder than thunder. When the storm cleared, the grounds of Ravenwood were pristine, as if scrubbed clean. Yet from that day forward, a palpable heaviness hung over the estate, an atmosphere so oppressive that even travelers passing along the distant road felt their horses shy and resist. The Ravencrofts' power only grew. With money, they secured silence from local authorities, donating generously to the town, offering loans to farmers, paying for schoolhouses and mills. Few dared to question them openly, for to speak against the church was to invite not only social ruin but unexplained misfortune. Crops failed, barns burned, children sickened. Whether these events were mere coincidence or something orchestrated, none could say. What mattered was that fear kept mouths shut. Inside Ravenwood, the rituals darkened further. The catacombs beneath the estate expanded year after year, carved with astonishing precision, as if guided by hands that knew more than simple masonry. Passages twisted like a labyrinth, chambers opened into halls supported by pillars carved with grotesque faces, and in the deepest vaults pools of water reflected the torchlight in ways that made the ceiling appear to ripple and breathe. These were not merely basements or wine cellars, they were sanctuaries for rituals too unspeakable for the open air. It was whispered that some of the tunnels led beneath the forest itself, surfacing in hidden groves where hooded figures performed ceremonies under the moon. In 1837, a traveler named Jonathan Hale, a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania, attempted to investigate. Drawn by the rumors and a personal suspicion that his missing brother had fallen victim to the church, he found lodging in a nearby town and began documenting the strange happenings around Ravenwood. His diary, preserved in fragments, described nights of observing fires in the trees, of hearing cries carried by the wind, of finding bones, human bones, scattered in shallow ditches. One entry, written in a trembling hand, spoke of hearing a choir of voices echoing through the earth as though the ground itself were singing. Another described being pursued in the woods by figures whose footsteps made no sound. Hale vanished in October of that year. His belongings were later found at the inn, his diary unfinished. The final entry read only, "The door is open tonight. I go to see what lies beneath." He was never seen again, but his diary passed quietly into the hands of townsfolk who dared not speak of it openly. Portions of it eventually reached newspapers, though always watered down, framed as the delusions of a madman. The Ravencrofts denied ever knowing him. By the 1840s, the Church of the Pure Spirit claimed over 400 members, a staggering number given the secrecy of its practices. Ravenwood had become not only a mansion but a city unto itself. Workshops produced textiles and carvings sold in towns far beyond Virginia, their profits flowing back to the family. Children were raised within the compound, taught from birth that obedience to the Ravencrofts was obedience to the pure spirit itself. Outsiders were rarely permitted entry, and those who did reported an eerie uniformity, the silence of the followers, the lack of laughter among the children, the way every room smelled faintly of iron and smoke. The strangest accounts concerned the garden, a walled space within the estate where only the most loyal were allowed. Witnesses who glimpsed it described grotesque shapes growing from the soil, trees twisted into forms resembling human torsos, flowers of unnatural size that reeked of decay, fountains that gurgled with water tinged red. Whether these visions were truth or madness remains uncertain, for none who spoke of the garden lived long after. Even within the Ravencroft family, fractures appeared. Some whispered that Ezra's youngest daughter, Abigail, had grown uneasy with the practices, her diary later suggesting that she wished to flee. She wrote of her father's eyes, of how they glowed in torchlight, of the chanting that grew unbearable. In her final entry, she begged forgiveness for what she planned, yet no escape was ever recorded. Her name, like so many others, appears in the Book of Ascended, her fate swallowed by the silence of the Church. By mid-century, whispers of the Church had spread beyond Virginia. Lawmakers, clergymen, and even early journalists began pressing for investigations. Yet time and again these inquiries failed, sabotaged by missing witnesses, vanished records, or sudden deaths. One sheriff who dared attempt a raid was later found drowned in a creek, his lungs filled not with water but with ash. Another investigator fell from his horse and was discovered with every bone broken, as though he had been crushed by some unseen weight. It was not until the late 1850s that the Church finally faced serious exposure. Survivors who escaped began to speak, their stories filled with terror. They described whippings, starvation, and forced rituals that demanded the sacrifice of animals, and sometimes more. They spoke of the catacombs, of chambers where walls dripped with blood, of shrines built from bones. One young man, barely 20, told of being locked in a pit with corpses and commanded to pray until he could no longer distinguish between sleep and waking. His testimony was dismissed as hysteria, but his scars told otherwise. The Ravencrofts, however, remained untouchable. Their wealth shielded them, their influence muted the voices of accusers. To this day, debate rages over how many truly perished in Ravenwood's shadows. Conservative estimates suggest dozens, but some whisper of hundreds, their bodies never recovered, their souls claimed by a doctrine that promised purity but delivered only horror. The fire that consumed the Ravenwood jail was more than an accident of history, it was the birth of legend. Witnesses described the night in 1851 as a storm of confusion. Flames licked the sky, guards shouted as the cells cracked open, and amidst the chaos, the towering figure of Ezra was glimpsed slipping into the darkness, his eyes burning brighter than the fire itself. Some swore he was aided by unseen allies, whispering that the cult's influence stretched farther than anyone dared admit. Others insisted it was divine intervention of a darker kind, that the same spirits the Church of the Pure Spirit claimed to worship had freed their prophet for greater work. Silas, caught in the aftermath, was tried and hanged, but he went to his death with lips sealed, a faint smile suggesting that something unfinished remained. The ruins of the octagonal church stood silent after the raids, yet the land never knew peace. Locals avoided the forest, claiming to hear muffled cries from beneath the earth. Travelers swore the shadows moved unnaturally among the mossy stones. When investigators finally returned in 1862, spurred by new testimonies and political pressure, what they found chilled even the most hardened men of law. Beneath the shattered altar, stairways descended into catacombs more extensive than anyone had imagined. Passage after passage revealed bodies preserved in states both grotesque and sacred, some arranged as if in prayer, others mutilated and posed as icons of suffering. The tally of victims swelled beyond 400, a number so monstrous that newspapers struggled to print it without sounding like fiction. And yet the truth was darker still, for among the corpses were children, their tiny frames preserved beside elaborate carvings that hinted at rituals never before recorded in Christian or pagan tradition. The documents unearthed in those years painted a story not of random madness, but of deliberate philosophy. Silas's journals, preserved in ash-stained trunks, spoke of a desire to chart the anatomy of the soul through torment. Diagrams sketched the body as a cage of energies, with pain as the key to unlocking what lay within. Caleb's rambling visions described a ladder of suffering by which mortals might ascend into purity, each rung requiring sacrifice. Ezra's writings, more commanding, declared the mission as global. Ravenwood was but the seed, planted so that others across the continent might take root. It was these pages, and not the bodies, that led some to whisper that the Church of the Pure Spirit did not die in fire and gallows, but rather scattered, like embers waiting to ignite. Indeed, in the decades that followed, stories emerged in towns far from New York. In a remote settlement of Ohio, an abandoned barn revealed strange symbols carved into beams, identical to those etched on Ravenwood's altar stones. In Louisiana, rumors spread of children vanishing during revival meetings led by a preacher who claimed to speak of purity through trials. Even in the deserts of New Mexico, explorers found a ruined chapel whose octagonal design echoed the black stone church in Ravenwood, though its origins were shrouded in silence. Whether these were true offshoots of Ezra's movement or coincidences twisted by fear, none could say. But to those who believed, the thought that Ezra had survived and seeded new cults was too plausible to ignore. Meanwhile, scholars debated the meaning of the cult's obsession with suffering. Some dismissed it as sadistic fanaticism, a product of three disturbed brothers who preyed on the vulnerable. Others argued it was a twisted mirror of the revivalist fervor that swept the burned-over district, where hundreds of sects preached radical visions of salvation. But there were always those who looked deeper, noting that many of the church's rites echoed fragments of older traditions, Norse sacrifices to Odin, who hung upon the tree to gain wisdom, medieval flagellants who scourged themselves for purification, even whispers of Mesoamerican rites where blood opened the path to the divine. Perhaps, they suggested, the Ravencroft brothers did not invent their creed, but inherited pieces of forgotten lore, stitching them into a new gospel of agony. The human cost, however, was never abstract. Families torn apart by the cult's promises left scars across generations. Survivors told of mothers who handed over their infants, convinced suffering would preserve their souls. Widowers wept over wives who joined the rituals and never returned. The descendants of Ravenwood carried a legacy of silence and shame, many fleeing the area altogether, their names changed to escape association. And yet the land itself bore memory. Farmers plowing fields unearthed bones, charred relics, or carved stones that should not have been there. The state erected no official monument, preferring to bury the scandal under layers of reform. But the whispers persisted. By the late 19th century, amateur historians and sensationalist writers resurrected the tale. Penny dreadfuls painted Ezra as a demon in human form, leading secret midnight masses where blood replaced wine. Spiritualists claimed to contact the souls of the victims during seances, their voices shrill with warnings of unfinished work. Even respectable academics could not resist the pull, dissecting the cult's theology in journals and debating whether it represented madness, manipulation, or genuine spiritual experimentation gone horribly wrong. Each retelling blurred fact with legend until the truth became a shadow among shadows. Yet one detail refused to fade, the journal entries hinting at Ezra's escape. Some said he boarded a ship for Europe under a false name, carrying with him sacred texts and relics. Others believed he vanished westward, into the untamed frontiers where law was thin and isolation plentiful. In both cases, stories of strange churches and sudden disappearances followed. Though no definitive proof ever surfaced, the possibility haunted every historian who studied the case. If Ezra lived beyond Ravenwood, then the cult was not an isolated horror, it was the opening act of something far greater. Even in modern times, the legacy casts a shadow. Hikers in upstate New York sometimes stumble upon fragments of stone carved with spirals, half buried under moss. Paranormal investigators flock to the ruins, claiming recordings of voices crying out from beneath the earth. Archaeologists who study the catacombs speak of an unease that lingers in the tunnels, a heaviness in the air that science cannot explain. And families in the region pass down warnings: never wander the woods at night, never answer voices calling your name from the trees, never touch the stones that hum faintly when struck. The Church of the Pure Spirit was, by all accounts, a human tragedy of unparalleled scale, yet it also became myth, blending with America's darker folklore. Some remember it as a cautionary tale of fanaticism and blind faith. Others see in it a mirror of power's corruption, how charismatic leaders can twist grief and hope into tools of control. And for a few, it remains a tantalizing mystery, a puzzle with missing pieces that suggest the story is not yet finished. Perhaps the truth lies buried still, waiting for some future hand to unearth the last of the journals, or to stumble upon a hidden chapel deep in forgotten woods. What can be said with certainty is this: the forests of Ravenwood remain silent, but the silence is uneasy, as though holding its breath. The stones of the church are blackened with age, the moss thick upon their surfaces, but step too close and one feels watched. The unmarked graves, hundreds strong, rest beneath the soil, yet their presence presses upon the living like a weight. History closed the chapter, but the book feels unfinished. For those who listen carefully, when the wind cuts through the trees, it carries a murmur like distant chanting, and the earth itself seems to whisper of the pure spirit, a reminder of what once thrived there in shadows.